Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Roman Raconteur, and I hope you're doing well. We're a couple of days into December, so I'm going to do my November Marginalia video. So sort of a summary of the different short stories, poems, essays, anthologies, articles, all the stuff I was reading that I didn't post any videos about last month. And it's just the strange or normal tangents that my mind was sprinting or drifting down. And it was a good reading month in terms of my Marginalia and my other reading. Of course, with poetry, we're continuing reading poetry at night with the kids, a couple of nights a week. So I had pulled down my Viking Portable Matthew Arnold, and there were some that they asked to have reread. Dover Beach, of course, and then Philomela. I read that more than once with the girls. That was one of those, Dad, read that one again tomorrow. I will oblige. I also we were reading some Elizabeth Bishop, an absolutely outstanding poet. One of my favorite, poets from the United States after World War II. And this volume's great. It also has some stories she wrote, some critical essays, critical introductions, but it also has almost 200 pages of her letters. And so I perused some of those. Robert Lowell, who was a poet recommended by someone in a previous video. There are numerous letters to Lowell, Randall Jarrell, who I'll mention as the editor of a later short story anthology again this month, and then Mae Swenson, an outstanding poet. And it's interesting to see Bishop and the ways in which she discusses society and art in her life with in a very critical, reflective, but authentic way with those folks. Sort of continuing in the poetry vein, introducing in the nonfiction vein, the Psalms in English, an outstanding anthology. I saw this on Steve Donahue's March of the Penguins and was instantly interested, and then didn't see a copy. And I finally found a copy online this past month, and it was like one of those buy now shit. And really goofy, strange cover here. This is attributed to Girolamo dei Libri from the late 15th century. But this has translations sometimes from major English poets. So there's a number of poets, Crashaw, a number of poets who pop up in here, Christopher Smart, and it kind of extends from the 16th century all the way to the 18th century. And after the Romantic movement, there aren't as many poets who feel a need to go in and try and translate the Psalms from the Christian Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And this is a great anthology. I've really enjoyed it. I'm still in the 16th century, so I haven't made it up to the point at which the King James Authorized Version has, been translated and compiled and edited. And but I'm really enjoying it. It's interesting to see Psalms that I'm super familiar with, and then some of which are even sung as hymns, and then see what that looked like in 1530. And it's interesting. It's enjoyable. Following sort of from that vein, I read all but about the final 4 chronological surahs from the Qur'an. I finished it last night in December. And this is a translation by Talif Khalidi, and I really liked this translation. This is the second time I've read the entire Qur'an. There's a couple of texts from Turkey and Egypt that I know I want to read either this month or next year, the Dictionary of the Khazars. And so I wanted another read-through of the Quran just to sort of have a foundation to approach those from. And this is a great translation. I haven't decided whether or not to do a full video on it, but it was a really good translation. Let me know if you'd be interested in whatever limited thoughts I have on that text. I'm, of course, continuing to read Emerson's journals. His wife died young. He left the ministry. He took a almost year-long tour of Europe, and now he's back in the United States, and he's getting salty. But I do think I will, in 2021, do sort of a series where each month I do an essay from Emerson's first series of essays. So starting with history, and then self-reliance, and then ending with circles, intellect, art, to close out October, November, December. So I'm leaning towards doing those. I'm still reading his journals kind of as gathering thoughts, because his essays are sort of the distilled form from public lectures, which were, created from thoughts he had in his journals. So there's this interesting sequence. I'm continuing, of course, with Reporting Civil Rights Part 1, an outstanding anthology. Really appreciating everything I'm learning or remembering or being able to see like the different relationships between major civil rights leaders and how instrumental like so many individual people were within that movement, whose names, you know, aren't in the history books, whose names aren't holidays. And it's just fantastic. With Here Lies Herodotus, I was digging into my Plutarch, who didn't like Herodotus as much as I do. I'll just leave it that way. Plutarch has his little moral comparisons he wants to make. I did read, and I really enjoyed this. I love Stephen Jay Gould's essays. He's one of my favorite popular science writers, certainly my favorite popular science, like biology writer. And these anthologies collect monthly essays he was writing for natural history. And within Dinosaur and Haystack, there's a great one about Edgar Allan Poe. It's called Poe's Greatest Hit. It is about, I believe it's the only book that was reprinted, got a second printing, or was still in print when Poe passed away. I want to say it's the only one that was reprinted. And it would surprise you what it is. If you don't know, it's this great trivia. Look it up and let me know in the comments, and we'll talk about it. But it's a great essay, and Gould, of course, has this very humane and humorous way of looking at what Poe's contributions might have actually involved in this text. I did look through the essays and reviews to see if it was in here, if there was any mention of it, and there wasn't. But I did come across this hilarious little piece, so I wanted to share this. Mills says that he has demonstrated his propositions, just in the same way Anaxagoras demonstrated snow to be black, which perhaps it is, if we could see the thing in the proper light, and just in the same way the French advocate, Linguet, with Hippocrates in his hand, demonstrated bread to be a slow poison. The worst of the matter is that propositions such as these seldom stay demonstrated long enough to be thoroughly understood. So there we have, you know, if Emerson's salty, Poe can be downright acid. There was a comment in a Noah Baumbach film. I believe Noah, at Everyone Who Reads It Must Converse, mentioned a Noah Baumbach film in one of his videos, talking about JR and the dialogue. But there's a line in one about like, well, you have to admit there's a certain laughability to Kant. So when my wife and I watched that and we were laughing at the line, I pulled down my Kant to look at just a couple of his essays. He had one on Enlightenment, what is Enlightenment? And he has one that's called Idea for a Universal History with Cosmopolitan Intent. And one statement in there that I thought was interesting was, as long as states will use all their resources for their vain and violent designs for expansion, and thus will continually hinder the slow efforts toward the inner shaping of the minds of their citizens, and even withdraw from their citizens all encouragement in this respect, we cannot hope for much, because a great exertion by each commonwealth on behalf of the education of their citizens is required for this goal. Every pretended good that is not grafted upon a morally good frame of mind is nothing more than a pretense and glittering misery. And just felt, you know, relevant. In terms of some short stories, I had loads of short stories. As I was reading the Qur'an, of course, there's a very powerful, similar to what you find in the Old Testament prophets, the Hebrew Bible prophets, some of those levels of like imprecations. And there's one that talks about, you know, Arabic cities, Ad, Thamud, and Iram of the Pillars. And Iram of the Pillars is mentioned in The Nameless City by H.P. Lovecraft. So I kind of went and pulled that down, reread that. The Nose by Nikolai Gogol. Great video from the Codex Cantina. So I revisited a very fun story. And I view The Nose as having being deeply informed by certain tales from the Arabian Nights. Specifically the connotation of the barber being the one who finds the nose and what the nose might sort of symbolize in terms of like emasculation, because within the Tales of the Arabian Nights, Tales of the Thousand and One Nights, the barbers would have been the ones to perform that on someone, and I'm not talking about a nose. So a great story though, really interesting. I read The Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen, which many are familiar with, but it's fun to like revisit it, and always remember that it's the voice of the child who cries out like, hey! So I always enjoy that. I read, is it The Sword of the Vulture? Let me see if I got that right. Shadow of the Vulture by Robert E. Howard, which is set in at like the Siege of Vienna. Really interesting This is in his Sword Woman and Other Historical Adventures that are set, kind of across sort of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, like through up towards the Age of Enlightenment. A Worn Path by Eudora Welty. A couple of people, I think Brian at Bookish, the Codex Continu, both did videos on that short story. So I read it. I thought there was a lot of great symbolism in there, and just creating, for me as a reader, a real sense of dread. And so it was a good story. I'll be reading more Eudora Welty. And then in terms of like complete books from the Bible that I was rereading, books of Habakkuk and Nahum. And then I was in Randall Jarrell's short stories, Book of Stories, and as I mentioned, he was corresponding with Elizabeth Bishop. And there's a number of really, really enjoyable stories in here that I found. This time I read a couple that had they were poetic stories. So Robert Frost's The Witch of Coös, Bertolt Brecht's Concerning the Infanticide, Marie Farrah, and then a couple of short stories I read that I thought were really interesting. Giovanni Verga's La Lupa was probably the most mediocre. Her Table Spread by Elizabeth Bowen was interesting. I really enjoy Bowen's The Last September. Great novel. I read The Story of the Siren by E.M. Forster, and I think I actually like that. Whereas with Bowen, I preferred that novel to the story that was in here. I think The Story of the Siren might be my favorite Forster work that I've ever read. Hugo von Hofmannsthal's A Tale of the Cavalry, The Bucket Rider by Franz Kafka. And then the one that I really liked was, of course, The Three Hermits by Tolstoy, and how there's a sense of surrealism in that story, especially if compared to The Nose by Gogol, maybe not. But there's a sense of surrealism. But what I thought was really interesting was the idea that Tolstoy, in my reading, was pushing this idea that it's not it seems ridiculous and surreal when the hermits, walk on the water, and you want to laugh. But there's also this element of their attitude towards spirituality it emulates the apostolic attitude, the attitude that so many strive for, and we often think of like the words or the practices, but forget about the attitude to emulate. And the hermits seemed to have captured that, unlike, of course, the bishop, who was just, you have to recite it in this order. But again, what's in your heart? So just a really great story. And I believe that was everything in my Marginalia. In terms of songs, a couple of quick songs. We were listening to Isaac Hayes' Black Moses, which is a fantastic album, but a really great song from that is Man's Temptation. I'll link that. And then my daughters were talking about how they really like rock and roll. So we listened to a little bit of AC/DC in the car one night, and they really liked the rock and roll. Dad, we like rock and roll. So I'll put in Down Payment Blues from AC/DC's Power Age album. So enjoy. Let me know if you've read any of these, what you think about them. And I'll see you later this week. Thanks, everyone.